Now, Ms. Lauren, you've been asked to provide your expert opinion regarding Mickey Keenan's investigation that led to the arrest of Avery Bancroft. Is that correct?
Correct.
And to do this, you reviewed a series of materials.
Yes, I did.
You reviewed materials that you received from a public record request with the Midland State Police Department.
That is correct.
And you also reviewed affidavits and other exhibits provided to you by defense counsel. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And from these documents, you reached the conclusion that Mickey Keenan's operation was deficient in a series of regards.
Yes, I did.
Now, you also relied on an audit that you performed earlier of his police agencies. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Your firm, Greylord Strategies, performed an audit of the Midland State Police Department in 2014.
That is correct.
And in performing this audit, you analyzed the Midland State Police Department's level of compliance with the Attorney General's undercover guidelines.
That is correct.
Now, I just want to take a step back and talk about these guidelines.
Okay.
The undercover guidelines were created in the 1980s, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And they were created so that there would be standards among law enforcement agencies regarding undercover operations.
Yes.
And these guidelines were set forth in the early 1980s.
Yes, they were.
And law enforcement agencies across the country adopted these guidelines as they saw fit.
Yes.
And once law enforcement agencies adopted these guidelines, they reformed their practices to comply with the guidelines.
Correct.
And the guidelines are not federal law, are they?
No.
They're not state law.
No. Well, the undercover guidelines are thought and implemented by the Attorney General's office, and so that is on a federal state. But as you said, each agency applies them as they see fit.
So just to clarify, though these guidelines were set forth by the federal government, they are not federal law.
Correct.
And so these guidelines are only followed by the law enforcement agencies that have adopted the guidelines as their own practices.
Yes, that is correct.
And law enforcement agencies adopted these guidelines throughout the 80s, 90s, up until today.
Correct.
And you are aware that the Midland State Police Department only adopted the undercover guidelines in 2010.
Yes, that is also correct.
And your firm did its audit in 2014.
Yes.
Now, your firm didn't perform any audit of this agency before 2014, isn't that correct?
No, we did not.
And to the best of your knowledge, no other firm similar to yours performed an audit between 2010 and 2014.
Not to my knowledge.
So again, to the best of your knowledge, your 2014 audit was the first evaluation of the MSPD's compliance with the undercover guidelines.
To my knowledge, yes.
And now let's talk about Mickey Keenan's operation. Mickey Keenan's operation began in the summer of 2013, isn't that correct?
Yes. As I read in his affidavit, he began.
And as you read in his affidavit, his arrest concluded with arrests in May of 2015.
Correct.
So his operation lasted for a little under 2 years.
Yes.
And so his operation was roughly concurrent with the period when your firm performed its audit of his police agency.
Correct.
Your firm's audit began after Mickey Keenan began his operation.
Yes, that is also correct.
And your firm submitted its conclusions in November of 2014.
Correct.
So when your conclusions were submitted to the Midland State Police Agency, Mickey Keenan had already been undercover for over a year.
Yes, that is true.
And Mickey Keenan did not have access to any of the recommendations that your firm gave to the Midland State Police Agency until November of 2014.
Correct.
Because prior to November of 2014, your audit had not been completed.
Correct, but the Midland State Police Department had implemented these guidelines in 2010, meaning that Mickey Keenan should have been aware of them and knowing how to properly implement them in order to properly conduct an undercover investigation.
Now, Ms. Lauren, to redirect you back to my exact question, Mickey Keenan did not have access to your specific recommendations until November of 2014.
That is correct, but he had access to the proper undercover guidelines that he should have followed.
Thank you, Ms. Lauren. Now, I want to talk about some of your criticisms of his operation specifically. First among those was your criticism of Mickey Keenan's training, isn't that correct?
Yes, I noted a lack of documentation in Mickey Keenan's training.
You could not find any documentation about Mickey Keenan's training when you submitted your public record request in 2014, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And you submitted this request when Mickey Keenan was still undercover.
Correct.
And you submitted this request while Mickey Keenan was undercover under an alias.
That is correct.
So you could not find any public records regarding an undercover officer in 2014, isn't that correct?
That is correct, and for that reason, I approached Officer Keenan's superior, Chief Kimball, for an interview for which my request was denied in order to interview Chief Kimball in order to have access to any potential further documents.
So as you stated, Chief Kimball denied your request for an interview.
That is correct.
And so you were unable to gain any information regarding training beyond public records.
Correct.
So you did not review any records that stated that Mickey Keenan didn't have undercover training, isn't that correct?
Correct.
You're merely referring to a lack of documentation confirming his training.
That's correct. However, I've been in this field for over 25 years, and never once have I come across this situation where I've had absolutely zero documentation, either through public request that has not been provided to me.
But again, just to confirm, these public record requests were filed while Mickey Keenan was undercover under a secret alias.
Correct, but I've worked other cases where that has been the exact same case, and I've received those documents.
Now, I want to move on to the second thing that you discussed, authorization.
Yes.
Now, there are a variety of different undercover operations, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And in order to make sense of these different kinds of operations, the undercover guidelines classifies them as Group 1 and Group 2 operations.
Yes, that is correct.
And these two groups have different standards for authorization.
Yes, they do.
Group 1 operations require 2 steps for authorization, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
But Group 2 operations only require 1 type of authorization.
That is also correct.
Group 2 undercover operations only require authorization from the police chief of the agency conducting the operation, is that correct?
Correct.
And you found evidence that Mickey Keenan received authorization from his police chief, isn't that correct?
That's correct. However, this was not a Group 2 investigation. This was a Group 1 investigation. And for that, the authorization had to come from the District Attorney of Midlands, which was J.F. Glinka. And she reported having no knowledge of authorizing such undercover investigation, nor did she have any knowledge that an investigation of Avery Bancroft involving Mickey Keenan was in fact going on until she was approached in November of 2014, early 15, for the arrest warrant of Avery Bancroft.
Ms. Lorraine, let's return to the question I asked you. A Group 2 undercover operation only requires
Objection
authorization.
has been answered, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I respond?
I'm going to overrule that. I don't think she's given a yes or no to that, so he's just clarifying.
Yes,
Yes, sir. A Group 2 undercover operation only requires authorization from a police chief, such as the authorization Mickey Keenan received from his police chief. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. However, this was not a Group 2. This was a Group 1 investigation.
Now, Ms. Lorraine, this is your conclusion, isn't that correct?
My conclusions of the case and what I
Allow me to clarify.
evaluated?
Based on your expert opinion, you concluded that Mickey Keenan's operation would be considered a Group 1 operation.
Correct.
But in all the documentation that you reviewed from the Midland State Police Department, you found nothing indicating that the Midland State Police Department classified his operation as a Group 1 operation.
No, I evaluated it as a Group 1 based off of previous cases I've worked, as well as the guidelines that I've implemented, as well as the criteria to meet each group.
But in order just to clarify this for the jury, the Midland State Police Department did not classify Mickey Keenan's operation as a Group 1 operation.
No, they did not.
In fact, the Midland State Police Department did not clarify exactly which type of undercover operation under the undercover guidelines that they considered his operation to be.
That's correct. That's why I had to go and evaluate each criteria, and I assigned it as a Group 1.
And so if the Midlands Police Department classified Mickey Keenan's operation as a Group 2 operation, he did receive all of the sufficient authorization. Isn't that correct?
If it was a Group 2, yes. However, it was not.
However, you cannot conclusively say whether or not the police department viewed it as a Group 1 or a Group 2
Objection has been
operation.
answered, Your Honor.
Yeah, it's sustained. Move on.
Now let's move on to the third topic that you discussed, entrapment. Now you thought that there could be significant risk of entrapment based on the tactics used by Mickey Keenan. Isn't that correct?
I highlighted several coercive tactics used by Mickey Keenan to recruit Hyde as well as keep Hyde on as an informant during his investigation.
And the main tactic that you objected to was his use of the Reed technique.
There was the Reed technique, as well as not knowing how to handle situations that involve otherwise illegal activities. Also in knowing how to handle situations in order to avoid inducing criminal activity and otherwise innocent parties.
Ms. Lorraine, let's step back and talk about the Reed technique for a few minutes.
Sure.
Now you object to the Reed technique because it uses various psychological constructs in interrogation. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
And you feel that this could be considered a coercive tactic.
If used improperly, yes.
But Ms. Lorraine, the Reed technique is extremely common among law enforcement agencies, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
The Reed technique is commonly accepted among law enforcement agencies nationwide.
Yes.
Agencies such as the Midlands Police Department.
Yes.
And these law enforcement agencies routinely employ the Reed technique in their investigations, both undercover and not undercover.
Yes, that's correct.
And now let's move on to the fourth topic, predisposition. You concluded that you found no evidence that Avery Bancroft was predisposed to commit this act. Isn't that correct?
I didn't say no evidence. I said no reasonable indication that Avery Bancroft was predisposed.
No, I'm sorry. You found no reasonable indication that the defendant Avery Bancroft was predisposed to bribe Chase Covington.
That is correct.
And you formed this conclusion based on the evidence that you reviewed.
Correct.
The evidence that you reviewed consisted of public record requests,
Correct.
affidavits,
Yes.
and exhibits.
Yes.
Now I'd like to talk about the last two of these categories. The affidavits and exhibits that you reviewed were provided to you by defense counsel.
Yes, they were.
You were provided with 3 affidavits.
2 affidavits and 1 report, yes.
And you were provided with a total statement of 3 witnesses, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And you reviewed these affidavits prior to coming to trial.
Yes, I did.
And based on the affidavits you reviewed, you concluded that there was no reasonable indication that Avery Bancroft was predisposed.
Yes, I did.
But you've never interviewed Avery Bancroft.
No, and all of my time working, all the cases I have, my experience, it was not necessary.
It was not necessary for you to speak to Avery Bancroft?
No, in my opinion, I had all of the documentation I needed to thoroughly conduct my investigation and analysis.
Ms. Lauren, it was not necessary for you to speak to the person who you were saying was not predisposed to commit bribery?
No, it was not.
And so you felt no need to ever interview Avery Bancroft?
No, I did not.
Objection, that's an answer, Your Honor.
Overruled, I think he's finishing up with that.
You felt no need to interview Avery Bancroft? Is that
No, I
correct?
did not.
No further questions?